A veteran ranged DPS main, or even a savage raiding ranged main, might find it entirely obvious why things like why you might actually want to stand up close to the enemy, as well as the value of coordinating cooldowns. Such a player might also know about both the traps in the toolkit and when those niches actually are a good thing. Now, obviously, some mistakes are much more impactful to make than others. However, regardless of that, these kinds of mistakes might not even come up on the radar for newer players, or perhaps even somewhat casual players. Of course, if you beat a dungeon, or a boss, or whatever it is, then you probably did just fine. Most of these mistakes listed in this video will mainly be things that can make your experience easier and faster, and likely might just feel better. So, in this video, I will cover a few common, or at times uncommon, mistakes, and then explain how it can be done differently to fix it. Number 1. I'm probably safer far away from enemies. It feels like the obvious choice to stand as far away from enemies as you can, since many enemies are melee and so would have to come over to you before they can hurt you. While this is slightly true, especially since ranged DPS can simply keep running away to keep the gap from closing, most enemies outrun you, and so this gap will close eventually. More importantly, a lot of enemies are perfectly capable of hitting you specifically from anywhere if they want to hit you. They might be ranged, they might have a circle AoE they can put on you, they might have a donut AoE which now will hit you because you're far away. They might aim a cone AoE at you, which now, because you're hanging out over there in Narnia looking for Aslan to help you escape, the cone is now 40 miles wide and you're going to get hit. If you had been up close, then you would have more options to escape, and in the case of that cone AoE, it would have been much slimmer, because you would find yourself at the start of the cone instead of the end of it. That is to say, if you cannot come up with a good reason why you're over in Narnia, come closer. A lot of enemies have circle AoE centered on themselves, so sometimes not all the way up close, but, you know, within a reasonable distance of the boss is a good idea. Add to this that ranged DPS jobs have party-wide effects, and some of these, while they have really long range on their area, they're not infinite. So, if you are performing that technical finish for the White Witch instead of the boss, then there's a very real possibility that some players in your group will not get the benefit of the damage bonus. Finally, while healers have a reasonably long range on many of their healing spells as well, they don't have infinite range either, so there is a very good chance that the healer will completely miss you with their AoE healing if you're hanging out in Narnia. And while some healers will send a single target heal your way to make sure you don't die from that mistake, some healers will outright take offense to you dodging their heals and instead intentionally leave you out to dry. So, in other words, the vast majority of benefits of being far away from an enemy are mainly false senses of security. If the boss wanted to hit you, it would, from across the arena. Being far away does not help you very much beyond giving you 1 or 2 extra seconds to accept your fate before the boss comes up and smacks you with that tank buster anyway once the tank dies. Why did the tank die? Oh, the healer was too busy casting heals on you, you see. My recommendation here is to default to being closer to enemies, and then go further away if you know it is beneficial, rather than doing the opposite. Number 2. Mildly absurd freestyle rotations. This one is a bit complicated, but less so than for mages. Melee DPS jobs have a lot going on, but a lot of it is very on rails in some capacity, where you can do whatever you want when you want, by which I mean the guardrails sort of guide you in a specific direction, but most cooldowns are free to use when you want them. For mages, it is often the case that they can actually do whatever they want with their toolkit, leading to a lot more opportunities to do things completely wrong. Ranged DPS is situated somewhere between these. The order in which you do things in sets can be quite important. For example, it is somewhat significant for the performance of a dancer that you use technical finish before devilment, which is somewhat counterintuitive, since technical finish is your strongest attack, right? But because they both come with damage buffs and a similar duration, using them together leads to a greater whole. Under optimal play, machinists have a super specific order to their tools. And while you could use that hypercharge whenever you want to, there are many wrong times to use it, mainly if it delays a tool, but the game doesn't prevent you from making that mistake. Bards can completely screw themselves over by either A, using the wrong song order, or B, switching to the next song too early, or too late, although that one is less painful looking forward. Use the wrong song? Well, it is going to be really hard to fix that at all for this entire duty. Switched songs too early? Oh boy, you won't like what's coming to you in around 2 minutes. No song for a bit. Woohoo! What I mean by this mistake is that because of the way these jobs are designed, you can easily find yourself doing something that is not exactly considered effective. But as far as you can see, it looks perfectly right. For example, it makes perfect sense for a bard to lead with Mage's Ballad in a dungeon, because Mage's Ballad does the most AoE damage of the three, or maybe second. Army's Paeon is also pretty good at this. The important part is that Wanderer's Minuet is not as good at AoE. However, Wanderer's Minuet is considered the by far best for single target. And if you lead with Mage's Ballad, then you will also have Mage's Ballad line up with your 2-minute cooldowns. Notably, that means that when you get to the first boss in an average group, Mage's Ballad will come off cooldown alongside Battle Voice and so on, and not Wanderer's Minuet. The general idea here is that while Wanderer's Minuet is a bit weaker on AoE, the sheer amount of cooldowns you use on that first pack will make up for that, and then you have Mage's Ballad into Army's Paeon for the second pack, the 2 superior AoE songs, and then Wanderer's Minuet comes up for the boss. In a similarly weird way, Machinists can easily make a mistake simply by using Flamethrower. Not because Flamethrower is outright bad, but because it is really awkward to use well. Flamethrower does 80 potency per second, so it clearly beats the combined average of Scattergun and Outer Crossbow of 72.5 potency per second. However, Flamethrower only has 2/3 of the cone range and you can't move while using it, so you cannot reposition it for a better spread. This can often mean you miss out on a lot of damage. And while we are on the subject of weird areas for AoEs, Machinist's Chainsaw, Bard's Apex Arrow and Blast Arrow, and Dancer's Starfall Dance are all surprisingly thin line AoEs, so you really need to make sure to position yourself right before using them. Anyway, that is a slight sidetrack, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say, that ranged DPS can easily trick themselves into the wrong order of things and do far less damage than they could have done if only they knew. Number 3. Sitting on cooldowns. For ranged DPS, it isn't uncommon for them to have cooldowns with very specific purposes, as well as multiple damage buffs. Not Machinist though for that one. And while they have these, it is still normal for those cooldowns to align with everything else under normal circumstances. This, combined with simply having a lot of cooldowns that can do a lot of damage, can lead ranged DPS to simply sit on them for just the right moment. But when is that exactly? Since these kinds of specific cooldowns can drift away from the rest of the cooldowns, this can cause you to sit on the other cooldowns to align everything. For some players, they also simply decide to save cooldowns specifically for bosses, which is a massive loss as well. Consider the power difference on a big AoE pool between a dancer that just does filler, maybe a flourish and standard step, but otherwise just filler, versus a dancer that goes into technical finish and devilment and goes full blast. Not only does that make the dancer do way more damage, it also makes the rest of the group do more damage. And part of the benefit of doing this is that if everyone goes full blast, there's a chance the pack dies before you run out of damage cooldowns, which means you can spend that low value filler time running to the next pack. Now, that is a rather specific example. However, what I'm getting at is that using your cooldowns on cooldown is often better than sitting on them or trying to perfectly align them every time. Of course, there are situations where the fight is just about to finish up anyway, so saving the cooldowns makes the next fight a bit quicker, but that's a specific case. Let's take some particular cooldown examples that ranged DPS jobs have a tendency to get weird with. For Bard, Sidewinder being single target sometimes makes players skip it on AoE, but it is free damage, just use it on the tankiest mob. Similarly, once Shadow Bite is learned, using Barrage on AoE is often better actually. Finally for Bard, Radiant Finale is a weird one. It is better to use it in your initial opener with just 1 sticker than sitting on it until you have 3. Why? Because it has a cooldown of just under 2 minutes and it takes 2 minutes to get 3 stickers anyway. For Machinist, Air Anchor is a cooldown that, at the very least, you might appreciate the battery gauge from using it while the tank is still rounding up mobs. And Wildfire is actually activated by auto crossbow as well, so there's nothing preventing you from putting it on the tankiest mob, hypercharge and then letting it rip. And finally, remember that Bioblaster first of all exists, and second of all, if you use Reassemble on it, only the initial hit will benefit. The entire dot will not, making it terrible. On large AoE packs, your best options are Chainsaw and then Scattergun for Reassemble, because Scattergun does more damage than auto crossbow. For Dancer, well, the main thing to consider is to use all of your cooldowns even on AoE. Given that Dancer has an AoE version of all of their single target attacks, I guess there aren't really any oddities beyond that one with Devilment. Use it after technical finish. Number 4. What do you mean defensive cooldowns? Ranged DPS jobs have at least 2 defensive cooldowns each, with Bard and Dancer actually having 3. If you don't ever use them, they go to waste. Obviously, among these defensive cooldowns, all 3 have a raid-wide 10% damage reduction. Now, here's the thing. You may have heard about healers being recommended to use AoE healing cooldowns for just the tank's benefit. You probably already know where I'm going with this. Unless you need that raid-wide defensive cooldown in a moment, you could support the tank with an extra defensive. The same also applies for Bard's Nature's Min, increasing healing received, which makes the healer's job easier as well. Machinist having an extra 10% damage reduction on a specific enemy with Dismantle is more intended for a boss of course, but just don't forget it exists, right? Dancer's Improvisation also helps with a bit of healing and a barrier when there is downtime in a fight, and if nothing else, you can actually weave it for a quick regen effect on those near you. This is similar to how you can use Curing Waltz to heal everyone nearby, which is even better if you stand with your dance partner for it. And then there is Bard's Warden's Paean. If you see a debuff with this blue line over it at all, you can just toss them that Warden's Paean. You can also sometimes even make it a DPS gain for yourself or someone else, since you can use it to intercept a debuff that can be removed, and you can use it on yourself to block something like a Doom effect from a gaze mechanic that you're planning to ignore. Or you can do that on another DPS as well. The only OGZD Isuna is a lot better than you'd think. Remember to use your defensive options, especially those that can help the rest of your team. Number 5. The Pentaweave. Right, so I set up my Wondrous Minuet. Okay, next I use Battle Voice and Radiant Finale and Raging Strikes. Now I can use Sidewind and Imperial Arrow for maximum damage. Oh, and let's not forget Barrage for that Refulgent Arrow burst. What about your GZD in all that time, right? How about that? Now, this isn't exclusive to Bards, but they do have the biggest "let me set up all my damage buffs" situation of the 3 ranged DPS, which makes it more common to happen in the first place. This usually happens if the player is not aware of why it is so important to keep the GZD spinning. A nice way to look at it is to think of your GZD as a 2.5 second cooldown, obviously, and if you want to use everything on cooldown, then obviously you have to use your GZD every 2.5 seconds, and then fit everything else in between. To give a perhaps more clear example of this, Bard's Imperial Arrow has a cooldown of 15 seconds. A Bard wants to use this on cooldown. They also have Sidewinder, which has a cooldown of 60 seconds. Sidewinder is only slightly stronger than Imperial Arrow, and given all the other goodies that Imperial Arrow causes, it is probably better overall. But more importantly, if you delay Imperial Arrow by 1 GZD, you lose 1/6 of an Imperial Arrow over the course of a fight. If you delay Sidewinder by 1 GZD, you lose 1/24 of a Sidewinder over the course of a fight. It is a lot less likely you even lose a Sidewinder cast at all by doing so. Compare this to the actual GZD. If you delay your GZD by 1 second, then you lose out on 40% of a base GZD over the course of a fight. It is immediately lost, because there's a 100% chance you will actually see that GZD be lost. This is why it is important to keep the GZD spinning. Because of the way animation locking works after an action, you cannot use another action for at least half a second after you used something, and this is increased by 2 times your latency. Some actions for ranged DPS have shorter GZDs, like Dancer's Dance Finishes and Tilana, and Machinist's Heat Blast and Auto Crossbow, which means you can only fit 1 OGZD after those. With that said, most players are able to at least single weave 1 OGZD between 2 GZDs, without delaying the GZD. The important part is filling OGCDs between your GCDs. If you are curious about this particular subject, I have a video where I go more in depth about it. In fact, I have several, and I will put a link to at least one of them in the description. Bonus number 6. Splitting damage buffs. This one is a bit weird, but the players that do it usually come up with a genuine reason for it that kind of makes sense. That is to say, it is not done blindly. The reasoning goes somewhat as follows. If I use Raging Strikes, and then when that ends I use Battle Voice, and then when that ends I use Radiant Finale, then I have a higher average damage boost over a longer period of time, so I do more damage with all of my attacks for longer. This is even more likely to be the case because of a song like Wanderer's Minuet, which lasts a whole 45 seconds. Well, 42 that matters, but you know what I mean. It is a bit like the same logic as defensive cooldown cycling. Now, the problem with this is of course that because your filler rotation isn't nearly as strong as your burst, spreading your damage buffs out over a long period of time will increase the damage of your filler, which is weaker, while reducing the damage of your burst, which is stronger. By spreading out buffs like Raging Strikes, Battle Voice and Radiant Finale, you're mainly boosting that burst shot spam slightly, while taking away damage buffs from things like Barrage, Sidewinder, your Dots, Apex Arrow and Blast Arrow. Notably, the 1 or 2 Imperial Arrows during your burst would benefit more from stacking these kinds of damage buffs. Doing an Imperial Arrow with all 3 buffs and one with Raging Strikes up would be more beneficial than doing 2 arrows with Raging Strikes, one with Battle Voice and one with Radiant Finale, even if it sounds like more. This is because of how buffs stack together multiplicatively. For a simple example, Raging Strikes 15% and Radiant Finale 6% combined results in a 21.9% damage increase, not a 21%. And just focusing on those two, having one Imperial Arrow with no buffs and one with both is better than having one with one buff and one with the other. This similarly applies to dancers of course, where they sometimes decide to split up technical finish and devilment completely. Again, it is better to keep them together. The problem with this particular mistake is that it usually stems from a player trying to get too smart with the game. It isn't that complex, genuinely, just bash all those cooldowns and go ham. It is also more fun that way, you get to click the buttons more. There can be niche exceptions though, where a fight specifically calls for you to not go full blast, or you might need the burst later, but this is mainly in a Savage or Ultimate context where you know that beforehand. So with that said, do you have any advice for aspiring ranged DPS players? Maybe a mistake you see happen a lot? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally, Bard's Battle Voice had a 5-minute cooldown, which was reduced in Heavensward. Furthermore, it used to only be usable while you were singing another song, like Wanderer's Minuet. And, originally, it didn't affect yourself. Both of these things weren't changed until Endwalker.